Shaquille O'Neal stood smiling on the steps of City Hall, and an hour later, he was face down in handcuffs. A racist cop didn't recognize America's gentle giant, or maybe he just didn't care. One leaked video would turn sympathy into nationwide fury and expose the system's darkest secrets. Big Shaq wasn't just arrested, he was about to turn the badge inside out. This time, silence wasn't surrender, it was a revolution. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was a Tuesday soaked in sunlight, the kind that makes marble buildings glow and makes even the most cynical passerby stop for a photo. The mayor of Atlanta stood on the steps of City Hall, smiling too hard, squinting into the glare, flanked by half a dozen suits and 3 camera crews. Beside him stood Shaquille O'Neal, dressed in a tailored navy blue blazer, his hands clasped politely in front of him, and a gold badge-shaped pin shining against his chest. They were unveiling a bold new campaign. Human behind the badge. It was meant to rebuild trust, restore dignity, and reconnect the people to the uniform. Shaq, beloved athlete, entrepreneur, community giant, had been chosen as the face of the movement, not just a celebrity endorsement. This was personal. He'd grown up dodging cops and clinging to the words of his mother, Lucille, who once told him, "Never forget your size is a threat before your heart is a comfort." Now, decades later, he was trying to be the bridge no one else could build. The speeches were short. The applause was polite. The mayor handed Shaq a commemorative plaque, and cameras clicked like rain on a tin roof. Then, one by one, the crowd began to disperse. Politicians back to their offices, journalists into vans, the mayor into a black SUV with tinted windows and a running engine. Shaq lingered behind, talking to a small group of teenage boys from a local mentorship program, laughing at something one of them said, bending slightly to take a selfie. And that's when it happened. The sound of a police cruiser's tires rolling up against the curb was quiet, unnoticed at first. The door opened with a groan. A uniformed officer stepped out, tall, thin, mid-40s, jaw tight like concrete set overnight. His nameplate read Halter, Officer Brent Halter. Not from this precinct, not from this part of town. Just a beat cop rotating through downtown on a shift trade. He didn't see Shaquille O'Neal. He saw a large black man standing too close to a government building. Standing too tall, dressed too nicely, surrounded by teenagers. He saw Shaq, turned halfway from the crowd, didn't notice Halter approach at first. The kids didn't either, but one of the security guards, a wiry man named Clarence, who had worked Shaq's detail for years, moved forward and casually said, "We're good here, officer." Halter barely looked at him. "What's going on here?" he asked, hand resting lightly on the edge of his holster, where no weapon had yet been drawn, but the energy buzzed like it had. Shaq turned, smiling, easy. "Just wrapping up. Event for the city. Mayor was here." Halter's brow tightened. He didn't recognize the voice. He didn't recognize the face. Maybe he didn't want to. "You got any ID?" he said. Clarence stepped forward. "Sir, this is Shaquille O'Neal." "I didn't ask you," Halter barked. "I asked him." The air changed. The boys went quiet. A local reporter who had stayed behind started recording on her phone, just in case. Shaq didn't raise his voice. "Officer, I'm the new police outreach ambassador. Just finished an official event. I've got documentation if you need it." But Halter's hand was already moving. "Turn around," he ordered. "Put your hands behind your back." The moment wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was colder than that. A public humiliation played in slow motion under blue skies. Shaq blinked, surprised. "Wait, what?" "Turn around, now." Clarence stepped forward again, voice raised this time. "You can't be serious. I said back off." The boys started backing away, eyes wide. The reporter whispered into her phone, "Oh my God, he's really doing it." And then the moment broke. Shaq, ever composed, slowly turned around and complied. His size made it look surreal. The way the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, how he had to bend just to fit into the cruiser. The officer never raised his voice again. Didn't need to. The act spoke loud enough for everyone. By the time the squad car pulled away, the first video was already on Twitter. And by the time it hit its second 1,000 retweets, the mayor's team had called the precinct to ask what the hell was going on. But in the squad car, there was silence. Shaq stared out the window, breathing slow, counting seconds. He wasn't panicking. He'd lived this before, not the cuffs, not the badge, but the look, The decision. The moment someone sees your body and forgets your soul. And as Halter adjusted his mirror and radioed in the code, Shaq watched his own reflection, massive, composed, and strangely calm, like he had expected this, because part of him had. They pulled into the station. No crowd, no red carpet, just fluorescent lights and paperwork. Halter didn't say a word as he led Shaq inside. Didn't flinch when someone behind the desk whispered, "Is that?" But the recognition didn't spread fast enough to stop the process. Fingerprints, mugshot, temporary holding, everything except the jumpsuit. Shaq didn't resist, not with his hands, not even with his words, but inside he was building something. Back outside, the world was doing what the world does, fragmenting into outrage, defense, confusion. On Facebook, a woman posted a grainy video of the arrest, with the caption, "Another black man, same treatment. Does it matter who he is?" Someone replied, "This isn't about race, that cop was just doing his job." Another replied, "You sure? Or just another blind badge loyalist?" On TikTok, the clip became a trend, teens reacting to the moment Shaq's hands were cuffed, some in tears, others in fury. Lucille O'Neal, his mother, received a call from the mayor's office before she saw the video. She didn't scream. She didn't speak. She hung up the phone, grabbed her purse, and walked out the door with no destination in mind. Shawnee, his wife, was at home with Mayara when the news hit the TV. Mayara, glued to her phone, said nothing. Her face was still, but her fingers moved like fire, typing, posting, sharing. "They really arrested him," she muttered once. "They really did that." And at the precinct, Halter leaned against a desk in the break room, scrolling headlines. His stomach turned. His name wasn't in the news yet. But it would be, and something told him he had just arrested the wrong man in the most public way possible. Still, no apology came. No realization in his eye. Just quiet regret that he might be seen as wrong. Shaq sat on a bench in holding, back straight, hands folded in his lap. He could hear the whispers, the stares, the disbelief behind the glass. But he wasn't angry. He was patient. He wasn't plotting revenge. He was planning truth. Because in that moment, under flickering ceiling lights, and in the sour air of a precinct that had seen 100 stories like his, Big Shaq was no longer just a brand ambassador. He was a test, a line in the sand, a mirror, and the whole country was watching. Brent Halter had worked the badge for nearly 17 years. And in all that time, he prided himself on gut calls. The kind of instincts that made a man trust his own read over policy, over procedure, over paperwork. In his mind, he was the kind of cop who didn't second guess. If he saw something that looked off, he moved, fast. That's what had kept him alive, or so he liked to believe. And what he saw that Tuesday wasn't a moment to pause and ask. It was a moment to act. Big frame, urban clothes, surrounded by teenagers. Close to a restricted vehicle, his mind made it real before his eyes could prove it. He didn't know the mayor had just left the scene. He didn't know the event had ended 15 minutes earlier. He didn't know the man he was approaching had been on billboards, commercials, and CNN all week, as the new face of community policing. What he knew, or thought he knew, was that something didn't look right. That little flicker in his stomach he always labeled as danger. He never asked why it only showed up when a certain kind of man was standing too confidently, or too calm, or just too. When Halter stepped out of the cruiser, he was already wound tight. He'd been moved to this district on short notice after an incident uptown, one not officially classified as a complaint, but closely watched nonetheless. No one talked about it openly. Whispers in the break room, glances during roll call. Something about a misread confrontation at a gas station. No charges, but enough heat to warrant a temporary shift. That's how the brass put it. He didn't argue, just put on the uniform, kept his mouth shut, and made the drive across the city every morning. That morning, something had already rattled him. A voicemail from a woman he used to see, talking about lawyers, about custody, about what she would say in court. He'd listened to it on loop before the shift, jaw clenched, then deleted it without saving the number. He was in no mood for gray areas today. So when he saw a man taller than 6'7", surrounded by a group of youth and standing too close to a city vehicle, it didn't register as public figure. It registered as suspicion. He couldn't hear the laughter from inside the circle. Couldn't see the selfie stick in the boy's hand. Couldn't recognize the outline of a media badge hanging from the neck of the young girl standing nearby. All Halter saw was size, skin, and posture, and something old inside him, something carved deep into him long before he put on the badge, moved without thought. He approached hard, assertive, controlling the space before it controlled him. The man turned. Calm. Smiling. Too calm. That smile always set something off in Halter. He didn't know why. The kind of smile that suggested the man wasn't scared. And in Halter's world, people like him were supposed to be scared. Not disrespectful. Not calm. Definitely not amused. He asked for ID. The man didn't hesitate. Didn't fumble. He spoke like someone who had rehearsed exactly what to say in encounters like this. "I'm the new police outreach ambassador," he said, voice smooth, just wrapped up an official city event. The badge pin should have been a clue. The security detail should have been a wall. But all Halter saw was defiance, not in words, but in stature. In ease. And ease. In his mind was always arrogance, wrapped in threat. His hand drifted toward his cuffs out of instinct. In his ear, the mic crackled. Someone at dispatch asking for a status report. He ignored it. "Clarence," the security guard stepped in. "This is Shaquille O'Neal," he said, with the tone of someone who couldn't believe the moment was happening. But that name meant little to Halter. He didn't watch basketball, didn't follow the news, didn't scroll celebrity updates, or track city events. He lived in a bubble of routine: badge, street, shift, coffee, paperwork. And when people threw names at him, like he should know who they were, it only made him dig in harder. He ordered the man to turn around. Said it with sharpness, but not a shout, enough to make the moment clear. He expected resistance. He got compliance. That only confused him more. The cuffs clicked. The crowd went still. A phone was recording. He felt it but didn't care. Not yet. Not until the whispers turned to murmurs and someone gasped, "No way, that's Big Shaq." But by then, it was done. He loaded the man into the cruiser without saying much more, kept the radio silent, rolled slow through the neighborhood, eyes locked forward. It wasn't until the fifth red light that Halter finally glanced in the rearview and caught the man's gaze. Steady. Not angry, not shaken, just watching. Halter shifted in his seat. He didn't ask questions. Didn't want the answers. He pulled into the precinct, logged the arrest, filed it under suspicious presence near secure property, and started the intake. There was a moment, brief flickering, when the desk sergeant raised an eyebrow, looked at the printout, then looked back at the man in cuffs. "Is this?" But Halter didn't wait for confirmation. He walked back to the break room, grabbed his coffee, and sat in the corner near the old bulletin board. The badge on his chest suddenly felt heavier. His phone vibrated. 3 messages in quick succession. First from a fellow officer, "Bro, what did you do?" Then another, "Look at Twitter, now." And finally, the precinct group chat, a screenshot of Shaquille O'Neal in cuffs, trending under "Gen arrested Embassador." His stomach dropped. He tapped the screen, opened the feed, and there it was. Video after video, angle after angle, people screaming in the comments. "Racist cop arrests police ambassador. Proof nothing protects black men, not even fame. How do you not recognize Shaq?" He didn't have an answer, but something else started clawing at the edge of his thoughts. Not guilt, not even fear, just a slow, rising awareness that he hadn't just made a mistake. He'd made one the world would see frame by frame, for the rest of his life. Still, he said nothing. Didn't march to the sergeant's office to explain. Didn't offer a correction. Didn't check on the man he arrested. He sat sipping lukewarm coffee, watching his career flash across social media with a dozen hashtags. At home, his inbox was already filling. The city's internal affairs department flagged his badge for immediate review. An email from the mayor's office, unread. A suspension notice likely en route, but all Halter could think about was how fast it had all happened, and how easy it had felt in the moment to assume he was right. The body cam footage would be released within the hour. He knew that. He'd left it on. It would show everything. The calm voice, the badge pin, the refusal to listen, the silence from his end. And yet, something still ticked in his brain. A part of him that whispered, "But I followed procedure. I asked questions. I didn't use force." That part clung to his last thread of dignity, trying to frame the arrest as neutral, professional. But deep down, even he knew the truth. He hadn't seen a threat. He had decided there was one. The moment he saw skin before context, size before situation, the moment he let old wiring dictate a new decision. Back in the holding cell, Shaq sat quiet, Still not speaking. Still not demanding. Just waiting. The officers nearby kept stealing glances. Some of them had kids who worshipped him. Others had once taken photos with him at precinct fundraisers. Now they didn't know how to act. No one wanted to process the paperwork. No one wanted to be the one to look him in the eye. And Halter? He stayed in the break room, stared at the wall, and realized something he'd never felt before. Not fear of losing his job, but fear that maybe this was who he'd always been. And now, finally, someone had caught it on tape. The world didn't need him to explain. It already knew. By late afternoon, the video had carved itself into the bloodstream of every screen in America. There was no warning, no time to prepare, just a 30-second clip of Shaquille O'Neal being handcuffed on the steps of City Hall, hands behind his back, head bowed, the look in his eyes not of guilt, not of anger, but of some silent understanding that ran deeper than either. It played again and again on the news, on Instagram, on TikTok in split screens with users gasping or shaking their heads. The outrage wasn't just about who he was, it was about what it proved. If even Shaq, the symbol of safety, laughter, philanthropy, fame, wasn't safe from blind suspicion, then who was? Back at the O'Neal home, the news hit in real time. Mara was the first to see it. She hadn't been at City Hall that day, choosing instead to stay home and finish a school project. Her phone lit up in her lap. First a text from a friend, "Is this your dad?" followed by a video link. She tapped it, not thinking much of it. When it loaded, she froze. She didn't move. Not right away. The audio played once. Then again. Then again. Then she stood, walked into the kitchen, and placed the phone in front of her mother. Shawnee didn't look at it immediately. She was stirring a pot on the stove, thinking about what to make for dinner, wondering if Shaq would be home in time to eat with them. When she finally turned to the screen, her breath caught in her throat. She picked up the phone, stared for a long moment, then handed it back to her daughter. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched. Then Mira, with her usual edge softened by disbelief, said, "They really did it. They really arrested him." Shawnee swallowed, her voice low. "Where?" "City Hall." Right after the event, Shawnee walked into the living room, pulled out her own phone, and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. The mayor's assistant. It went straight to voicemail. Then she tried Shaq's publicist. Then Clarence, his security. Finally, she sat down and did the thing she hated most. She opened Twitter, and there he was, her husband handcuffed under the bright Georgia sun, treated like he was nothing more than a problem to be managed. Meanwhile, at a modest brick house on the west side of town, Lucille O'Neal stood staring at a muted TV, her hands wrapped tightly around a teacup she hadn't sipped from in over an hour. She'd seen the footage from 3 different angles. Didn't need the sound. She'd heard enough in her lifetime. Her son had been dragged through the dirt, not with fists or guns, but with presumption. That quiet, sharp-edged kind of racism that dressed itself in procedure and protocol. Lucille didn't cry in front of the screen. She didn't curse. She didn't even blink for several long seconds. Then slowly she stood, walked to the back room and pulled her coat from the closet. A car was already waiting outside. The mayor's office had sent it, a feeble olive branch in the midst of a media firestorm. She didn't ask where they were taking her. She didn't ask if it was safe. She just climbed into the back seat, closed the door, and said, "City Hall." When she arrived, reporters were already gathered, microphones out, cameras rolling. A chant had begun to form from the crowd. Half protest, half plea. "Let Shaq speak. Let Shaq speak." But it wasn't Shaq who appeared at the front entrance. It was Lucille. She didn't approach the podium. She didn't take questions. She walked slowly, head held high, tears sliding down her face, but her back unbroken. The crowd hushed as she passed. Reporters scrambled for angles. A journalist shouted, "Ms. O'Neal, what do you want to say?" But she didn't stop, didn't flinch, just kept walking. It was that image, Lucille O'Neal, tear-streaked and silent, flanked by city officials who didn't dare speak, that broke the internet. The photo went viral within 15 minutes. Someone captioned it, "The mother of a movement." Another user reposted it with, "Lucille doesn't need to scream." The world heard her silence. Celebrities began chiming in. Actors, athletes, activists, all demanding one thing, accountability. And yet the narrative had already begun to spiral in different directions. Some were calling it another George Floyd moment. Others said this time, "There's no excuse, the man is a national hero." But what most of them didn't know What hadn't yet made the rounds online was that Shaq wasn't just a beloved figure. He was the figure. The face of a reform campaign launched just days earlier by the same department that had now arrested him. That was the twist no one saw coming. Not even those inside the system. The officer Brent Halter had apparently never read the press memo, hadn't watched the campaign video where Shaq walked the halls of precincts, hugged retired officers, and talked about his vision for rebuilding trust. Halter hadn't done a basic Google search, and now that oversight had become national humiliation. As the hours passed, pressure built. Protesters began arriving at the precinct, not with signs of violence but with signs of mockery. "Google your victims," read one. Another said, "Big Shaq your whole department." The narrative was less about brutality now, and more about blind ignorance, systemic flaws and the danger of unchecked assumptions. Inside the O'Neal home, Mimura was live on Instagram. Not yelling, not crying, just talking. Her voice was low, clear, resolute. "They always say be respectful. That we're safe if we don't talk back. That if we're polite, we'll be okay. My dad didn't say one wrong word. He got arrested anyway. So now what?" The stream reached over 100,000 viewers in under an hour. Back at the precinct, Shaq still hadn't spoken. Not to the press, not to his legal team, not even to the officers quietly trying to figure out whether to apologize or retreat. He sat in the holding cell, breathing steady, waiting. Not for his release. He could have had that with one phone call, but for the world to see what silence could expose. He knew his mother hadn't spoken, and that was more powerful than any speech he could give. He also knew Miara was watching. Shaq had always taught his children to rise above anger, to take the high road even when the road was steep. But he also knew that silence, when used with precision, could slice deeper than any scream. And that's what this moment demanded. Not outrage, not panic, but patience that revealed the cracks beneath the surface. The mayor, sensing the scale of disaster, called an emergency meeting with senior officials. A press statement was drafted, rewritten, then shelved entirely. No apology could fix what was already done. They needed a new approach. Someone floated an idea. Let Shaq speak. Give him the floor. But the problem was, Shaq hadn't asked for the floor. He already owned it. By evening, a new hashtag had taken hold. Silent Shaq. It wasn't about cowardice. It was about composure. About how a man could stand taller in silence than others did on podiums. Commentators began dissecting the footage. Legal analysts started discussing implications. Civil rights leaders reached out, offering support. And in homes across the country, families watched together, not just because it was news, but because it struck a nerve that was older than cameras. Older than badges. It reminded people that justice wasn't about celebrity. It was about how quickly dignity could be stripped, how easily assumptions could take precedence over humanity. Lucille returned home late that night, her phone vibrating nonstop. She didn't answer any calls. She didn't respond to texts. She walked into the kitchen, made tea, and sat by the window. Mara came in and sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Mara whispered, "They all saw." Lucille nodded. They did. And somewhere, deep inside that quiet, something had already shifted. Not just in the O'Neal family, not just in Atlanta, but across the entire country. A moment had cracked the surface of what people thought was normal. It didn't take a riot. It didn't take a speech. It took a mother's walk, a daughter's voice, and a man's silence. And the world was no longer looking away. The office smelled like citrus and panic. Somewhere behind a frosted glass wall, an espresso machine hissed into silence as a cluster of executives huddled around a 70-inch monitor in a downtown Atlanta boardroom. It was early evening now, just enough time for the news cycle to enter its second rotation, and the footage hadn't stopped playing. On screen, frozen mid-frame, was their worst nightmare. Shaquille O'Neal face down against the back of a police cruiser, arms behind his back, silver cuffs flashing like betrayal. He was wearing the pin. The exact gold badge-shaped lapel pin their graphic designer had drafted, revised and approved 2 weeks earlier. The same one that had been ceremoniously handed to Shaq during the campaign launch event. A symbol of unity between law enforcement and the people. Now it glinted on the screen like a cruel joke. The tagline "Human behind the badge" burned in the corner of the PR manager's laptop like a ghost with a grudge. Carla Henderson, the director of public partnerships for the campaign, leaned against the table, her blazer half-buttoned, and her eyes flickering with disbelief. Her voice was taut, cracking with controlled panic. This was supposed to be the safest PR move in 10 years. It was Shaq, the one person who could make cops look human again. How the hell do you arrest Shaq? Next to her, Alan Becker, legal counsel, tapped his pen against a legal pad and muttered, "I want to know if the cop had a body cam and how fast we can get the footage suppressed." "No," Carla snapped. "That's the opposite of what we want. Transparency, remember? That's the whole damn campaign. But if the video makes Shaq look confrontational..." "Have you even seen the video?" Her voice cut sharp. He didn't even blink. He complied. He was calm, polite, quiet, and the guy cuffed him like he was a threat, while wearing our pin. Across the room, a junior associate unmuted the feed from a local news channel. The newscaster's voice was flat but edged with tension. Shaquille O'Neal, a former NBA superstar and community figure, was detained this afternoon outside City Hall in what witnesses are calling a misunderstanding fueled by profiling. The officer involved, Halter, has yet to be placed on administrative leave. Carla turned to the screen. "Mute that. We can't let the narrative spin us. We shape the story." Alan raised an eyebrow. "How exactly do we shape this?" Carla exhaled slowly. "We don't rush it. We gather facts, wait for the department to trip over itself, and then, we make Shaq the victim, who forgives." A sharp silence followed. Everyone knew how thin that rope was. The department's press unit had already issued a shaky one-liner. "The incident is under internal review." That wasn't strategy. That was stall. At the precinct's PR office just 3 blocks away there was no espresso machine, no boardroom table, no mood lighting, just a scratched-up desk and 3 employees trying not to scream at each other. The head of communications, Darnell Rivers, had aged 10 years in 10 hours. He held his head in his hands while staring at 2 open tabs on his screen. One showing the campaign launch video with Shaq smiling and shaking hands with cadets, and the other showing the arrest footage in painful slow motion. "Please tell me someone briefed Halter about who Shaq was," he groaned. The intern stammered. "He wasn't on the list. He wasn't even supposed to be assigned downtown today. His name got subbed in after that precinct fight last week." Darnell slammed his fist on the desk. Not hard, but enough to shake the stale air. "So a guy we're already watching for aggressive conduct just happens to get transferred to our most sensitive PR zone on the day our ambassador is in the area." The intern looked at his shoes. "Find me that transfer form," Darnell said. "I want names." Back at the corporate office, Carla's phone rang. She stepped out to take it, the door snapping shut behind her. Her voice lowered, but didn't soften. "Mayor's office?" Pause. "Yes. I saw it." Another pause. "No. He hasn't made a statement yet. And we're not pushing him to. He's still in holding, and frankly we don't want to look like we're pressuring a man in cuffs to save our campaign." The mayor's aide said something on the other end. Carla's jaw tightened. "Damage control. There's no damage control for what this looks like. We asked a black man to rebuild your department's image, and your department thanked him with handcuffs." She hung up. Inside the boardroom, another screen lit up. This one tracking social media sentiment. The chart spiked red. Top hashtags: Silent Shaq, Human behind the badge, Google before you grab, Shaq deserved better. Brand mentions were climbing, but they weren't the good kind. One of the execs scrolled through the comments. "These people aren't just mad, they're organized. They're tagging sponsors, threatening boycotts." Alan rubbed his temple. "We need a statement." "Not from us," Carla said, re-entering. "From him. But only if he wants to. And if he doesn't, then we shut up. Because silence speaks louder than spin right now." Back at the precinct, no one had yet approached Shaq directly. He'd been processed, escorted to holding, and quietly left there as the weight of the world settled outside the walls. Darnell knew he needed to speak with him, but didn't know how. "What did you say to a man you'd publicly partnered with, promoted, branded as a bridge, only to have your own system trample over him in front of half the country?" He paced. He drafted a script in his head, then deleted it. Meanwhile, internal calls flooded in. Sponsors, broadcasters, national campaign consultants. All of them trying to gauge the same thing. Is he angry? Is he done? Is he going to burn this whole campaign down on camera? No one had the answer. But the fear wasn't just about what Shaq would say. It was about what he wouldn't. A man like him, iconic, beloved, media-trained. He knew the value of silence, knew how to make a room hold its breath. If he chose not to speak, the vacuum would grow louder by the hour. Everyone would fill it with their own interpretation, their own indictment, and there'd be no way to stop it. Carla knew that too. Which is why by 8:00 p.m. she made a call no one expected her to make. Not to the press, not to the mayor, to Shawnee. Shaq's wife answered on the second ring, her voice dry, tired, steady. "I need to know if he's okay," Carla said. "He's fine. Waiting." Carla hesitated. "Will he speak?" Shawnee didn't answer immediately. Then finally, "He'll speak when people are ready to listen, not just react." "I'm sorry," Carla offered, and for once it was real. Shawnee sighed. "Tell the mayor that." Then she hung up. In a sleek office filled with campaign posters and mission statements, Carla leaned against the window, watching the city pulse with headlights and sirens and electric rage. Somewhere out there, the man they all counted on to humanize the badge was sitting in a cell, not asking for rescue. And maybe, she thought, that's what terrified them most. Because in this story, they weren't the narrators anymore. He was. Shaq could have been out in an hour. All it would have taken was one phone call. A single line to the mayor's office, to the commissioner, to any of the executives wringing their hands downtown. His release paperwork had been quietly prepared 2 hours ago. The DA had no interest in charges. The arresting officer had gone radio silent, and every public relations team within 50 miles was practically begging him to step in front of a camera and clarify the misunderstanding. But he sat still, back straight against the cold cinder block wall, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. No pacing, no muttering, just breath. Slow and intentional, like a man training his heartbeat for something deeper than just freedom. The holding cell was quiet now. No cameras here, no one around except for the night officer who peeked in once every 15 minutes, too embarrassed to make eye contact. The silence felt thick. Not dead, but heavy, like the calm before thunder. The kind that makes you brace even if you don't know why. Shaq didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for special treatment. He didn't even ask for his phone. And when the lieutenant came by earlier with a clipboard in his hand and panic in his voice, all he said was, "I'll wait." That was 12 hours ago. To the world it looked like stubbornness. Maybe pride. Maybe shock. But inside that silence was strategy. Because Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just a man wrongly arrested. He was a man who had seen this exact moment coming. Not the cameras, not the handcuffs, but the man behind them. Brent Halter. 2 weeks before the campaign launch, Shaq had sat in a closed-door meeting with Chief Barnett and 2 reform advocates who'd been vetting officers across the city. They handed him a dossier, thin, unassuming, marked discretionary concerns. Inside was Halter's name. 5 internal reviews, no disciplinary action, but enough smoke to warrant a close watch. Use of authority complaints, racially charged language flagged in transcripts, community tension. One advocate, a former cop named Lionel Grant, looked him square in the eye and said, "If this guy ever crosses your path, walk the other way." Shaq didn't forget that warning. He just chose to ignore it. Because this campaign wasn't about protecting himself. It was about confronting the cracks directly. About testing whether real change was even possible when the rot ran this deep. So when Shaq saw Halter step out of the squad car, he knew exactly who he was. Not because of a name badge, not because of the posture, but because he'd studied the faces, committed them to memory. Halter wasn't some random mistake. He was a known problem, a man the system had protected, because it was easier than admitting fault. And still Shaq didn't walk away. He stayed. He stood in that circle of kids, and let Halter approach. He offered ID. He spoke calmly. He gave every opportunity for de-escalation. But Halter didn't bite. Because men like that weren't trained to de-escalate. They were trained to dominate. And now, Shaq was proving that without lifting a finger, inside the cell, time moved differently. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shocked. He'd been black his whole life. Famous didn't protect you from assumptions. Rich didn't make you invisible to fear. The cuffs weren't the betrayal, they were just the symptom. The real betrayal had happened long before. He thought back to a moment, when he was 17. Tall, broad, already known in basketball circles, but still just a kid. He'd been walking home from a friend's house in Baton Rouge, wearing a hoodie and carrying a basketball under his arm. A squad car slowed beside him. Rolled down the window, 2 white officers inside, eyes scanning. One of them called out, "Where'd you steal that from?" He remembered how his stomach dropped. Not because he was afraid, but because the accusation wasn't new, just casual. Like they weren't even trying to insult him, just assuming it as fact. That moment lived in his bones. And now here he was again. A grown man, a father, a symbol of community, being treated like a threat because one cop decided size equaled danger. He closed his eyes and thought of Miura, of how she must have watched the video, of how many times he'd told her, "Be careful, stay calm, don't give them a reason." He'd given them nothing. And they still took his dignity like it was disposable. Yet he remained still. Not because he was broken, but because he wasn't. He knew the city was watching, knew the press was boiling over, knew the campaign teams were in free fall. That didn't matter. What mattered was what came next, and who controlled the first move. Across town, in the office of Lionel Grant, the same reform advocate who flagged Halter papers were flying. Lionel had watched the arrest on 6 different feeds, read every angle, and when he confirmed that it was that officer, the one he'd warned them about, he felt his jaw lock. Damn it, he muttered to himself. He knew, and he still stood there. He wasn't just talking about Shaq's courage. He was talking about the trap, because Shaq had stepped into it knowing full well who was on the other end of that badge. Not because he wanted martyrdom, but because exposing a broken system from the inside meant taking a hit that couldn't be spun, couldn't be redirected, couldn't be dismissed as exaggeration. Back at the precinct, someone finally worked up the nerve to walk toward the cell. It was Darnell Rivers, from the police department's PR unit. Not a cop, not a politician, just a man caught in the middle of a collapsing campaign, and a country asking questions louder than anyone could answer. He stood outside the cell for a moment, unsure if he should knock or speak, or just melt into the floor. Shaq turned slightly, met his eyes, said nothing. Darnell cleared his throat. "They're ready to let you go," he said quietly. Shaq didn't move. "They want a statement? Anything. Even just a line." Shaq's voice was low when he finally spoke. "Why should I talk for them?" Darnell hesitated. "Because people are waiting." Shaq's gaze didn't soften. "Then let them wait." It wasn't defiance. It wasn't ego. It was control. Because for once Shaq had every institution, media, law, politics waiting on him. Not to lash out. Not to cry. Not to accuse. But to decide what justice looked like when a man refused to perform pain for the camera. He leaned back again, eyes closing, breathing slow. Because silence wasn't weakness. It was the blueprint. And in that silence, he was building something they couldn't spin or sanitize. Not this time. Every headline rips through the same vein. Officer Halter didn't recognize him, didn't care who he was, treated him like a threat by default. And then the deeper cuts begin. Civil rights groups begin digging. By day 3, all 5 prior complaints are back on the table. By day 4, an open letter signed by 12 retired officers and 2 former internal affairs agents demands a full investigation into how Brent Halter kept his badge. The mayor is cornered into holding a press conference. She fumbles, stutters through lines about trust in process and lessons to be learned. But the public is past talking points. Because this wasn't just a bad arrest. It was exposure. A live broadcast of what many already knew, but couldn't prove. Shawnee watches from home, eyes glued to the screen, as commentators replay the footage again and again. Her phone doesn't stop buzzing. Friends, media, nonprofits. She ignores them all. Beside her, Miura sits with her laptop open, collecting links, compiling quotes. She started building a website, half tribute, half archive. Lucille, meanwhile, doesn't watch the news. She listens, sits on the back porch with the radio low, and lets the words wash over her, like rain. Every time a new detail comes out, another complaint, another sealed file, she shakes her head slowly. Not in surprise, but in sad, tired validation. She remembers Shaq at 13, already towering, already targeted. She remembers the day he came home confused because his white classmates could walk down the street without suspicion. But he had to carry his school ID in his hand, just to avoid questions. This isn't new, she murmurs to herself. They just finally picked the wrong man. At the precinct, Halter is placed on administrative leave pending investigation. They let him walk out the side door. No perp walk, no press. But the damage is done. He tries to call his union rep. Voicemail. Tries to call his supervisor. Straight to conference. For the first time in his career, no one answers. The next morning, the department receives a subpoena request from the state attorney general's office. They want every document tied to Halter's internal record. Every sealed file. Every anonymous note. The union pushes back. Calls it an overreach. But the court signs it anyway. That same day, a second leak emerges. This one from a retired officer, who shares a folder of emails years old, between Halter and a handful of other officers. The contents: casual racism, memes, jokes at the expense of suspects. A PDF guide titled How to Write Reports That Don't Get Flagged. It hits the media like an earthquake. Now it's not just about Halter. It's about culture. A system that didn't just tolerate him, but trained others in his image. Sponsors pull back. The department halts all public appearances. The reform campaign, once a shiny badge of progress, is now radioactive. And Shaq still hasn't spoken. He's home now, released without charges. No press conference. No statement. He walks through his house in quiet observation. Feels the tension in every room. Every face. But he doesn't break. Not yet. Because he knows the longer he waits, the louder the silence gets. And every second Brent Halter's name trends. Every past complaint resurrected. Every file unsealed. Proves that the system didn't need a speech. It needed sunlight. And now it had it. Because Brent's file was sealed for a reason. And the world just picked the lock. The chain around Shaq's wrists wasn't tight. But it was deliberate. The cold metal shimmered under the early morning sun, as he stepped out of the precinct's side door, flanked by two uniformed officers who avoided eye contact like it would burn. There were no sirens, no yelling, just the heavy silence of disbelief. It wasn't a perp walk, not officially. No cameras had been invited. No press conference was scheduled. But it didn't matter. The moment itself was the headline. Just 7 days ago, Shaquille O'Neal had stood at the same precinct, holding a ceremonial key to the city beside the mayor, smiling as the crowd cheered. Now he was being escorted, shackled, past the back gate, and onto a waiting van. A week had flipped the image like a cruel mirror. The sting wasn't in the cuffs. It was in who saw them. Across the street, a group of middle school students waited outside for a city-sponsored mentorship event. Field trip lanyards around their necks. Some wore Shaq-themed shirts. His face printed across their chests, smiling and larger than life. They weren't supposed to see this. They were supposed to hear him speak that morning. Hear about respect, community, leadership. Instead, they watched him being led away like a problem to be handled. The teachers tried to turn the kids around, shielding them with their arms, whispering reassurances they didn't believe. But the damage had been done. A boy in the front row, no older than 12, locked eyes with Shaq as he passed. That moment cut deeper than any interrogation. Shaq nodded to the kid barely, softly, and kept walking. He didn't say a word, didn't yell, didn't protest. Not because he didn't have words, but because they wouldn't fix what had already been framed. Inside the van, the air was sterile. He sat still, wrist chained to the bar bolted along the floor. He wasn't charged, wasn't convicted. But someone somewhere had decided a public transfer was necessary. It wasn't protocol. It was optics, designed to imply guilt without declaring it. Let the public fill in the blanks. Across town, the footage was already leaking. Not the live stream kind, but phone clips from the students' parents and teachers who happened to be on site. One 15-second video showed Shaq stepping into the van. The caption read, "How do you arrest the man teaching your kids about justice?" Another said, "Key to the city on Friday. Shackles by Wednesday." Within hours, they'd gone viral. At home, Mamera sat at the kitchen counter, holding her phone like it was a ticking clock. The moment she saw the clip, she didn't cry. She didn't post. She just stared. Because even in silence, she could feel the weight of what her father was choosing not to say. Shawnee came in behind her, saw the video over her shoulder, and let out a long breath. "They're trying to wear him down," she said. Myra nodded. "But they forgot who he is." Meanwhile, inside the precinct's operations room, a different kind of panic was unfolding. An unnamed clerk had flagged a file earlier that morning. A private video submitted alongside the initial arrest report. Not the official body cam footage. Not the cell phone clips. Something else. It had been uploaded into the precinct's evidence server without a tag, without a note, just a timestamp. The only label read, "Officer Halter, POV alt angle." No one had seen it yet. It hadn't been shown to the press. Wasn't included in the city's press kit. When the IT tech pulled it up, she froze. The footage showed a few seconds before the known clip started. A moment no one had captured yet. In it, Shaq is helping someone. An elderly man in a wheelchair, slumped halfway against the sidewalk. He's talking to him gently, trying to lift the front wheel off a curb. The man is muttering, shaking his head. Then Shaq flags down a volunteer, still holding the side of the chair. That's when Halter appears in the frame. Gun not drawn, but hand hovering over his holster. He sees the large black man, and never even looks at the man in the wheelchair. Instead, he barks, "Hey, what are you doing here?" Shaq turns, calmly, "Helping." The older man tries to speak but is ignored. Halter never acknowledges him, never looks at the wheelchair, only focuses on Shaq, who's still standing with an open hand, pointing toward the building, toward the event just finished. It's all there. The disregard, the immediate escalation, the refusal to process any context. And then, just before the official footage begins, Halter mutters, barely audible, "Another one acting like he owns the damn place." The phrase lands like poison. That sentence, buried in an unreleased video file, isn't just offensive.
It's indicting.
It reveals motive, bias, intent. The moment the precinct's legal team sees the clip, they realize it can't be contained. It's admissible, real, raw, and worse for them, it wasn't meant to be seen. Someone had quietly tucked it away, hoping it would die in the data pile. But now it was evidence, and Shaq didn't even know it existed. Back at the van, Shaq arrived at the courthouse through a private entrance. There was no arraignment, no charges filed, just a bureaucratic loop no one wanted to claim responsibility for. Inside, a city liaison offered him a seat and a weak apology. "There's been confusion," she said, without making eye contact. Shaq said nothing. She slid a cup of water across the table and cleared her throat. "There's growing support. You've got senators tweeting, athletes, celebrities. We think now might be the moment." "To what?" Shaq finally asked. The room went still. "To make a statement," she said carefully. "Set the tone. Let the public know how you feel." Shaq leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. The cuffs were gone now, but the weight lingered. "They already know how I feel," he said, "because they know how they feel when they watch it." The liaison tried again. "We've got talking points prepared. We're coordinating with your brand team." Shaq interrupted, not with anger, but finality. "I'm not here to protect anyone's brand." Her shoulders sagged. He stood slowly. His voice stayed low, steady. "The only reason I haven't spoken yet is because I was waiting to see who you would be without my voice to guide you." He turned to leave. "Now I know." And with that, he walked out of the room, not to cameras, not to fans, but to Mara standing near the exit with his jacket in her hands. "Ready?" she asked. He nodded once. Outside, the crowd was already forming again. Reporters, protesters, supporters, but this time, there were no chants, just phones raised, hands clapping softly, and a wave of silence as Shaq passed through. A silence that meant more than any slogan, because the man in chains had become something else entirely. Not a victim, not a symbol, a reckoning. Brent Halter muttered, "Another one playing hero for the cameras." That sentence gutted the entire defense the department had clung to for days. It didn't sound like protocol. It sounded personal, and it shattered the illusion that this was a misunderstanding. No one could spin that sentence into policy. It was bias, laid bare, dressed in disdain, captured by a 14-year-old who had no idea what he'd just done. Jalen didn't even realize what he had, until his cousin texted him, "Yo, is this your video?" It's everywhere. The clip had started spreading in closed chat groups first, among students, then parents, then local organizers. Someone posted it to a community Facebook group. Then Reddit got a hold of it, and within hours it made its way into the inbox of Ava Glassman, a legal watchdog journalist known for exposing suppressed police footage. She verified the time, location, and continuity with the already public body cam angle. The result was devastating. Because Jalen's footage didn't just fill in the blanks. It proved intent. It exposed what came before the arrest, before the handcuffs, before the spin doctors and PR managers tried to remold the story. And it also exposed something else. The complete and deliberate disregard for a disabled man in need. That part, strangely, hit the public even harder. Because while Shaq's fame made it a national story, the homeless veteran in the frame made it human. His name was Walt Deacon Laramie. Vietnam vet, 69. Partial amputation from a construction injury, no fixed address. He hadn't spoken to reporters since the arrest. But when Jalen's video dropped, He stepped forward. "I tried to tell that cop," he said in a brief interview, holding back emotion. "Shaq was helping me. He was the only one who even noticed me sitting there." He wiped his face with a trembling hand. "Cop looked through me like I wasn't real." That quote ricocheted through the media like a bullet through glass. And suddenly, the story wasn't about celebrity anymore. It was about humanity. In offices around the country, executives from brand sponsors scrambled to rewrite statements. Lawyers redrafted position briefs. Mayors called emergency meetings with police chiefs. Internal Affairs opened a supplemental investigation, not just into Halter, but into the chain of command that allowed the alternate angle to be buried for days. Questions piled up like bodies in a war zone. Why hadn't the footage surfaced sooner? Who had access? Why hadn't the arresting officer acknowledged the vet? Why did no one stop the transfer? And through it all, Shaq still hadn't spoken. He watched the video in the quiet of his study at home. Nora stood behind him, Shawnee beside him, Lucille across from him, unmoving. When the screen went black, he said nothing for a long time. Finally, he asked one question. "What's his name?" Mira replied first. "Walt Laramie." Shaq nodded. "Let's find him." By sundown, Walt was sitting on Shaq's back porch, sipping hot tea from a ceramic mug too delicate for his cracked hands. He looked tired, but not bitter. "You didn't have to come back for me," he said softly. Shaq shook his head. "I never left you." They talked for over an hour. No cameras, no handlers, just two men who had been seen as less than one because of skin, the other because of circumstance. Both understood what it meant to be visible only when convenient, and invisible when it counted. That conversation never got published, but its impact did, because Shaq made a decision that night. He didn't release a press statement. He released the video, from his account. No edits, no watermarks, no spin. The caption was simple: "Here's what they didn't want you to see." And the internet did the rest. In the next 24 hours, the video racked up 36 million views. Major networks aired it uncensored. Congressmen cited it in hearings. High school students broke it down frame by frame for classroom discussions. And Halter? His union pulled back. His supervisor resigned. And his past already exposed now looked unforgivable in context. Because this wasn't just a misjudgment. It was proof of pattern, of intent, and of a system that preferred erasure over accountability. But the biggest shift wasn't legal. It was cultural. The narrative had flipped. What started as celebrity arrested had become man silenced for doing good. Shaq, without raising his voice, without calling for boycotts or protest, had handed the public the raw truth. And they weren't just angry now. They were activated. Because if Shaquille O'Neal, giant in every way, could be treated like a nuisance for helping a man in a wheelchair, then the rest of them didn't stand a chance. Unless they fought, unless they watched. And now they were watching everything. Because a 14-year-old kid with a cracked iPhone didn't just expose a bad cop, he exposed a nation still pretending it couldn't see. The town hall was standing room only, and that was before the cameras started rolling. Outside, a line wrapped around the block, some people holding signs, others holding their kids, all of them holding on to a sense of anticipation that buzzed heavier than static. Inside the hall, the lights were low, but the tension was high. Civil rights leaders filled the front row, shoulder to shoulder with retired officers, community organizers, and families who'd shown up not for a spectacle but for clarity. The stage was simple. No podium, no seal of office, just a wooden stool and a single microphone stand in the center. It wasn't meant to be political theater. It was meant to be real, honest, human. When Shaquille O'Neal stepped onto the stage, the applause didn't erupt. It rumbled, deep and resonant. Not because the crowd wasn't excited, but because this wasn't about entertainment. It was about truth. And the room knew better than to cheer for pain. Shaq paused for a moment, towering above the crowd, then nodded once. The room quieted instantly. He didn't speak immediately, just looked around the room, at the mothers gripping their purses, the students with their phones raised, the old men in denim jackets with military patches. Every face watching him wasn't just asking what he would say, they were asking how he would say it. He adjusted the mic, cleared his throat. His voice was steady, low, unshaken. "I was raised to believe that respect is earned," he began. "Not by your title, not by your paycheck, but by how you treat people when no one's watching." He let that sit for a beat. No one moved. "A week ago, I stood in this city and accepted a role that meant something to me. Not because of the cameras or the contracts, but because I truly believed in bridging the gap between police and community. I believed trust could be rebuilt, that the badge could stand for protection, not control. Another pause. 3 days later, I was face down on the hood of a squad car. He didn't say it with bitterness. He said it like a fact. Because it was. I didn't resist. I didn't raise my voice. I wore the very pin that represented the work I'd just committed myself to doing. And still I was treated like a stranger, like a threat, like someone who didn't belong. There was a rustle of shifting bodies, uncomfortable breaths. He looked toward the side of the stage where Mara stood next to Lucille, both of them watching, both of them bracing. I stayed quiet because I wanted to give the system time to respond. I wanted to see what would happen when the person arrested wasn't anonymous, when he had a name, a family, a record of service, a public image. I wanted to see if all the things that usually get ignored would finally be confronted. His voice dipped slightly. They weren't.
That line hit like a hammer.
They tried to spin it. They tried to say it was a misunderstanding, that it was handled properly. But then the videos surfaced. First the official ones, then the one from Jalen, the 14-year-old kid, with the cracked phone, who caught what really mattered. Soft murmurs echoed at the mention of Jalen, now seated 2 rows from the front, phone resting on his lap, eyes wide, overwhelmed but steady. That video, Shaq continued, showed the truth, that I wasn't a threat, that I wasn't loitering, that I was helping a man who'd already been ignored, and that the officer didn't just make a mistake, he made a decision. He let that word settle. Decision. Because framing it as a mistake was too kind, too easy. Brent Halter has been suspended, he said flatly, and I won't pretend that's justice. It's not. It's accountability. Maybe. But justice is bigger than one man losing his badge. Applause began to swell, but Shaq lifted his hand slightly, asking for quiet. I don't want your claps. I want your action. The room fell still again. He turned slightly, addressing everyone. Tonight I'm not here to rehash the past week. I'm here to move forward. But I'm not doing it alone, and I'm not doing it without structure. So here's what happens next. A murmur of interest passed through the room. Not promises. Plan. Shaq stepped closer to the edge of the stage. First, I'm creating a civilian review coalition. Independent. Unpaid. Made up of educators, community leaders, veterans, and students. It will sit in on hiring panels, on misconduct hearings, on training reviews, not for optics but for oversight. People nodded. Phones came up. Fingers tapped. Second, I'm calling on every police department that receives city funding to release the last 5 years of sealed disciplinary records. Redacted for privacy, sure, but not hidden, not erased. The public has a right to know who's been trusted with power. A clap here. Then 2. Then more. Third, I'm redirecting every dollar I've received from this campaign partnership into a fund for families affected by racial profiling and wrongful arrests. Legal fees, therapy, transportation, whatever they need to fight and heal. Now the claps grew louder, sustained. And finally, Shaq said, voice firm, I will not accept another dime from any department unless their officers pass comprehensive anti-bias training, created and led by educators who don't wear the badge. A full standing ovation followed, not frenzied, but righteous. He waited for it to subside. When it did, his tone changed. Skeptics will say this is performative, that I'm trying to repair my image, that I'm leveraging fame for politics. They'll say I'm not qualified to lead this. He took a deep breath. But I didn't ask to lead. I was pushed. Pushed by cuffs, pushed by silence, pushed by a system that cracked open and showed its face one more time in broad daylight. He looked toward the back of the room, to the officers in the crowd. I don't hate you. I don't even blame all of you. But if you wear the badge and still stay silent, then your silence speaks louder than mine ever did. A pause. I had to be handcuffed before anyone listened. Maybe that says more than I ever could. Then, quieter. But now that you're listening, don't stop. The microphone clicked off as he stepped away. No encore.
No press.
Just a nod to Mara as he stepped off stage, into the crowd, and into the arms of the people. Not a man walking away victorious. A man walking toward something bigger. The police department called it a PR complication. A misunderstanding gone viral. A singular moment taken out of context, spiraling beyond control. But they weren't managing optics anymore. They were standing in the aftermath of something seismic. This wasn't a public image issue, it was a reckoning. Because what they thought was about one man in cuffs had cracked into a national mirror, and now that reflection was demanding reform. Shaq had disappeared for a few days after the town hall. No press tours, no Instagram stories, no corporate statements. He didn't vanish. He retreated. Not in shame, but in purpose. He was assembling something far more durable than sympathy. And when he returned, he didn't do it with a speech. He came back with infrastructure. The first announcement arrived not through news networks, but through a live stream on Mara's platform, watched by over 4 million followers. "This is no longer about me," Shaq said calmly, seated at a bare table beside civil rights attorneys, retired black officers, and educators. "It's about how we keep this from happening to someone who isn't famous, someone who doesn't have the world watching." Then came the blueprint, step by step, point by point, not ideas, action. He introduced the Civic Trust Reform Initiative, CTRI, a multi-phase national platform designed to overhaul community policing at its core. Its mission: expose what's hidden, retrain what's broken, and build a direct line of public access into every department that received taxpayer funding. It wasn't flashy, it was surgical. Phase 1: a national audit of sealed police records, especially complaints dismissed without hearing. Phase 2: mandatory quarterly training for officers in all precincts where civilian complaints rose above 20%, with the curriculum built by educators, not enforcement. Phase 3: an independent oversight board, cross-state and crowd-funded, made up of civilians from every major demographic group, including those formerly incarcerated, disabled citizens, and families of victims. No police badges allowed on the board. No political appointments. Phase 4: a youth ambassador program, led by under-25 community leaders like Jalen Brooks, whose video exposed everything. Their role: to advise on how youth experience policing and help departments adjust accordingly. Within 72 hours, 30 cities signed on. By the end of the month, 12 more followed, including cities previously reluctant to acknowledge systemic issues. Sponsors who once quietly waited to see which way the wind would blow now publicly aligned themselves with the initiative. Not because it was trending, but because not joining looked like cowardice. But perhaps the most poetic moment came when Brent Halter re-entered the public eye. He filed a wrongful termination suit, claimed he was unfairly demonized, used as a scapegoat, and denied due process. The claim made its way into the courts, briefly, until the cross-examination opened a new file, one that hadn't yet been made public. A written statement by a retired officer who had mentored Halter early in his career. The officer had submitted the testimony quietly, hoping it would never need to be used. But it was time. He described a conversation in the locker room 10 years earlier. Halter, furious over being reprimanded for pulling over too many suspicious individuals in a particular neighborhood, had said, "They want numbers? I'll give them shadows. They all look the same to me anyway." The words echoed through the courtroom like a verdict of their own. The suit was dismissed with prejudice. Public opinion shredded Halter's last attempt at redemption. Not because of Shaq, but because of Halter himself. The exposure had been complete. Back in Atlanta, Shaq remained steady, never calling for revenge, never asking for Halter to suffer. He never once said Halter's name again. His focus stayed on building, not breaking. He spent hours meeting with families who had endured similar experiences. Mothers of sons arrested for walking home too late. Fathers fired for refusing unlawful orders. Teachers who had watched students cry after being searched on the way to school. He didn't lecture them. He listened. He brought them into the fold. And slowly, the initiative became more than a project. It became a movement. A network of towns, cities, voices, and platforms all pulling in the same direction. Not against police, but against unchecked power. Against silence. Against the comfortable forgetting that so often followed moments like this. The phrase "not just a brand, a movement" became more than a slogan. It showed up on murals, t-shirts, bus stops. But Shaq never made a dime from the merchandise. Every cent was funneled back into legal defense funds, mental health grants, and youth leadership programs. He showed up not with cameras trailing him, but with clipboards, notebooks, and time. And people noticed, not because he was larger than life, but because he made space for those who were always treated as smaller. During a follow-up town hall, a mother named Bernice, whose son had been wrongfully detained the year before, took the mic. Her voice shook, but her words held. "When they cuffed you, Shaq," she said, "they tried to shrink you down to what they wanted you to be. But you got up, and instead of shouting, you built a ladder, and now we're climbing too." The room stood as one.
No applause.
Just solidarity. By spring, the Civic Trust Reform Initiative had federal eyes on it. A bipartisan group of senators reached out to discuss adaptation into legislation. Shaq refused to turn it into politics. He wanted action, not signatures. "If they want to adopt it," he said in an interview, "they can implement it. But I'm not here to run for office. I'm here to keep the badge honest." Reporters asked if he would consider a government role. His answer was simple. "No, I've already got the job I want." He pointed to a bulletin board behind him covered in handwritten letters from kids, vets, teachers, and former offenders now building lives post-release. "This is who I work for." The shift was undeniable. Departments that had previously called him an outside voice now asked for consultation. Academies began integrating the training into new cadet programs. And most importantly, communities that once feared their own protectors began seeing them challenged from within. Because the giant who'd once sold shoes and soda now stood for something far heavier.
Not for profit.
Not for image, for change. The city of Atlanta issued a second key, this time, not to the city, but to the future. A symbolic gesture. But this time, Shaq didn't hold it alone. He handed it to Miara. She raised it in front of a crowd of students, journalists and city officials and said, "This is not the end of my father's story. It's the beginning of all of ours." That night, in his quiet kitchen, Lucille placed a photo on the table. Shaq in cuffs, side by side with a shot of him surrounded by kids in police cadet uniforms. "Hard to believe it's only been a few weeks," she said softly. Shaq nodded. "It took one arrest to expose everything," he said. "Now it's going to take a lifetime to rebuild." She smiled. "Good thing you're strong." He chuckled. Gently. "Not strong," he said. "Just stubborn." And outside, under streetlights and blooming dogwoods, the movement kept growing. Quietly, steadily.
No sirens.
No violence.
Just a million small voices following the footsteps of a man who refused to stay silent. If you believe silence can be louder than hate, you're already part of this movement. If you know respect is earned, not demanded, your voice matters here. Stand where truth stands, even when it's uncomfortable. Because real change doesn't ask for permission. It starts with people like you.